Can you introduce yourself, Christopher, and tell us what you do?
Yeah, my name is Christopher Rosik. I'm a psychologist in Fresno, California. I'm a clinical faculty member of a university there. I am the current past president of the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity, and have been involved in other organizations as well.
Tell me something about the presentation that you gave today. What was the purpose and the title?
The presentation had to do with what I describe as non-scientific influences on the social science, particularly as it pertains to sexual orientation, but it really applies to controversial areas of social science in general, and how these non-scientific influences often are very important in shaping the final interpretations and understanding of data from science that is disseminated to the public.
Could you list the different influences that come to bear on scientific data and how it's interpreted?
Sure, I can list some of them that I can come right to mind. One would be just the fact that when you get right down to it, looking at the community of scientists and the professional organizations, there's very little ideological difference among the members of these communities typically. So sociopolitically, they share the same point of view. You do not find a lot of diversity in terms of viewpoint. And so one of the things that risks confirmation bias, which is where we tend to value results more highly when they match our particular moral and political beliefs. And we might tend to more disregard findings and results that don't kind of line up with our values and our socio-political beliefs.
Has it always been that way, or has there been a change?
I think human beings are always subject to something like confirmation bias, for instance, but I think it's gotten a lot worse as the field has become more politicized. So when you're dealing with policy relevant research, you're going to find a greater risk of that kind of confirmation bias, because the data could have implications for the policy and the political goals that are kind of behind things oftentimes.
So how would you read the world that we live in now in terms of the information that you're sharing now? What is happening?
I think there is somewhat overtly, but through these covert sort of sources, a dampening, a quelling of the ability of people to have information, to make informed decisions about topics like sexual orientation change and implications related to sexuality in general. So I think people are being deprived of valuable information. Like I said, not always covertly or overtly, but covertly through some of these influences. And it's also very true, and it's very unfortunate, that research research is not occurring that could be coming from a different point of view that might shed light on the subject matter, like sexual orientation change. We're never going to get to that unless we have people that are able, and researchers and scientists that are able to answer questions and frame the research problem and look at the data and bring to it different values and morals, because that will affect the interpretation oftentimes. So that's why diversity of viewpoint and diversity of ideological understanding and diversity of values is so critical to the practice of science. And when you don't have that, like we don't right now, you are bound to get a limited understanding, an incomplete understanding, and certainly possibly a false understanding of the actual subject at hand. such as the sexual orientation change.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, there is a lack of kind of critical interdisciplinarity or critical cultural...
Within discipline, a lack of give and take between different interpretations, different approaches. There are some, I would say, the conservative kind of perspective, traditional perspective, it's increasingly just politically incorrect to hold that and to come to research to that. It's not, research isn't funded. This is another factor. You need funding, and you need the ability to conduct very good research, access to certain databases, and that just is not very rarely available, for instance, in this area. So if you can't do research in it, it doesn't have to be even banned. Of course, if you ban something, then it's probably you can't possibly do research in something that's been banned. But even if it hasn't been banned, it's hard to do research when the professionals and the scientists who might even have an interest in it know that, if I do research in this and it comes up with results that go against the grain of what the political winds are wanting, that it could be career suicide for me, literally career suicide. We know what happened with the Regnerus study, or even the Spitzer study before him. Tremendous brushback, tremendous ostracization, and denunciation, and ethics complaints filed against you, and letters written against you to the editor of the journal where you published, and these sorts of things. I've had some of that happen in some of the writings that I've done, not to Regnerus's extent, but I know what kind of pressure comes to bear on editors and associations, So it's a tremendous. It takes tremendous courage to stand up against that, and just institutionally, it's very difficult. And it's getting more difficult. Right?
So has the world changed? What's brought this about?
I think the culture has definitely, shifted, and fairly rapidly, in an understandable desire to reduce harm to gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender persons. It's understandable, but in the interest of trying to do that, I think science, in many respects, has been hijacked, and I don't think you should base a civil rights movement on the suppression of certain data, such as that might not suggest that sexual orientation is biologically and/or genetically determined, right? And the sort of born gay view, very effective politically, even though even now gay researchers and in their own academic worlds would tell you that they don't believe that that's the case, that it's simply a matter of genes, finding the right gene or the right hormonal reaction in the womb.
So what's the anecdote? How does this change?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. I guess I'm not sure it will in the current climate. I don't know if I see it turning around immediately. I mean, I'd like to believe. I think if you had diversity, if you could somehow infuse worldview diversity among researchers and values diversity, and had a fairly balanced mix between sort of liberal, progressive scientists, researchers, and more conservatively oriented researchers, of which there are some. I think if there was more of a mix there, you'd more likely to come up with findings and interpretations of findings that are going to be closer to the truth than what we're getting now. I think if we did that, I think there'd be surprises for both sides. Really, I do.
So, what would your advice be to somebody who is beginning a research career and considers human sexuality to be something worthy of their attention?
Wow. I mean, I thoroughly understand, and I know there are a number out there, but I thoroughly understand a researcher or someone like that considering, I have a family to feed, I don't want to just be ostracized right at the beginning of my career. I'd understand them kind of staying somewhat under the radar. That's part of the pressure, another pressure against this kind of work. But I would hope that at some point they would find courage to do the research as the courage of a intrigued scientist, and find courage to do research that asks the inconvenient questions, that's willing to look at alternative hypotheses. And I will say that when you reach a place in your career where you're no longer intimidated by the name calling and all those sorts of things, it really is freeing. You have the freedom to actually ask questions and look at topics from the perspective of someone who's just curious. I have a genuine scientific curiosity that is not having to bow down to certain political correct viewpoints that really stifle science and would stifle what research a lot of people are willing to do.
Have you ever been silenced, would you say?
I would say yes, maybe not in dramatic forms, but I have been silenced. I can think of a particular situation that happened a year or two ago. I had an article that's submitted to a APA publication, and the reviewers of the article said that it was, had some things that needed tidying up, but it was good, and they thought it would be publishable in the APA journal. And this was an article that happened to include some discussion of change-oriented therapy in a level-handed, but I guess would be considered by some somewhat sympathetic standpoint, of course. At any rate, while the reviewers said, yeah, it's publishable, what happened was the managing editor basically said, sorry, I don't care what the reviewers say, this article is not going in our journal, which is another example of non-scientific influences. The journal reviewers are gatekeepers to what gets published in the literature. And I had to submit this article to about 3 different journals before it finally got into one that was a secular journal. It was an APA journal, however.
What else did you cover in your presentation today?
We talked a bit about what woozling is, which is a term from Winnie the Pooh.
What do you mean by woozling? You used this term in your presentation.
Woozling is a term that's taken from Winnie the Pooh stories, where Winnie the Pooh and Piglet are out for a walk, and I believe they're out in the snow, and they're walking around a bush, and they think, as they walk around the bush in circles, they think that there must be some monster afoot, because as they walk, they see these tracks that come alongside theirs, and they're not realizing that, of course, it's their tracks. They've been just walking in circles, and so they suspect, who concludes from that there must be a woozle that's after them, when in fact it really is just they're going in circles. And so the meaning of woozle just has to do with basically a monster is created in the world of science by when advocacy groups, for instance, and certain advocates will take science and they will cite something definitively and authoritatively and repeatedly over and over and over again, and it sort of takes on a life of its own as if it were real, when it's either not true or it's just an incomplete understanding of the science. And so that's the creation of a woozle.